The morning sun was bright as the factory floor came alive with the sound of machines. Workers in yellow hard hats moved about quickly, shouting instructions, loading boxes, and preparing for another busy day. Among them was David, a strong man in his 30s who had worked in the warehouse for many years. He knew his job well, driving forklifts, moving pallets, stacking heavy loads. For him, it was just another normal shift. But that morning, something felt a little different. The warehouse was busier than usual. Orders were late, deadlines were tight, and the supervisors kept rushing everyone to move faster. "Come on, we don't have time to waste," shouted the manager, his voice echoing through the high metal walls. The workers nodded and picked up their pace. Safety, it seemed, was no longer the top priority. David climbed into his forklift, started the engine, and drove toward a stack of heavy boxes. Each box was taller than a man and filled with machinery parts. They were secured with plastic wrap, but everyone knew that wrap was weak. Normally, the boxes would be tied down with straps and inspected. But today, with so many deliveries to finish, corners were being cut. As David lifted the heavy load with his forklift, he felt the weight shift uncomfortably. He frowned and slowed down, trying to balance it. "Be careful," one of his coworkers called from a distance. David gave a quick nod, but he also knew the manager was watching. If he took too long, he would be shouted at again. He pressed the gas, moving forward slowly across the warehouse floor. The towering stack wobbled slightly. "It'll be fine," David whispered to himself, keeping his eyes forward. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. At that same moment, another worker, a young man named Kevin, walked across the floor, holding a clipboard. He was checking inventory, focused on his notes, not paying attention to the forklift nearby. He stepped into the same path that David was driving. "Hey, watch out," someone shouted, but it was already too late. David turned sharply to avoid hitting Kevin, and the forklift tilted to one side. The stack of heavy boxes shifted violently. With a terrible cracking sound, the plastic wrap tore open. In slow motion, the load began to fall. Kevin froze in terror as the massive boxes crashed down. David slammed on the brakes, but the sound of destruction filled the air. The entire warehouse went silent for a moment, except for the noise of boxes smashing against the concrete floor. Dust rose into the air, tools clattered off shelves, and workers screamed. When the dust cleared, Kevin was lying on the ground, barely conscious. The boxes had missed him by just a few inches, but his arm was pinned under one of the smaller crates. He was lucky. If he had been one step to the left, he would have been crushed completely. David sat frozen in the forklift, his hands shaking, realizing how close they had come to disaster. The manager rushed over, shouting at everyone to move the crates. Several workers pushed the heavy box off Kevin and pulled him to safety. His arm was badly injured, but he was alive. The others stared in shock at the fallen load. Some whispered prayers of thanks. Others shook their heads in anger. "This could have killed him," one worker muttered. "This isn't just an accident, it's because we rushed, because we didn't follow safety rules." David climbed down from the forklift, his face pale. He couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if Kevin had been a little slower, or if the boxes had fallen in a different direction. The image of a coworker crushed under tons of steel haunted him already. The safety officer was called in, and soon the whole factory was buzzing with questions. Why weren't the loads properly secured? Why was Kevin allowed to walk so close to moving machinery? Why was the pressure so high that workers were rushing instead of working safely? The truth was clear. This was not just bad luck. It was a warning. Heavy machinery and rushing deadlines don't mix. One wrong move, one unsafe decision, and lives can be lost forever. That day, Kevin survived. But many others in similar jobs have not been so lucky. Across factories, warehouses, and construction sites, stories like this happen every year. Workers crushed under machines, trapped by falling loads, or killed when safety rules are ignored. The lesson is simple, but powerful. Machines can be replaced, but people cannot. No deadline, no delivery, no order is more important than a worker's life. Safety must always come first, because once a tragedy happens, it cannot be undone. As the workers gathered around Kevin, helping him to the ambulance, David whispered again, this time with conviction, "Nothing is worth this. Nothing at all." The air was hot and heavy as the construction site buzzed with noise. Sparks flew from welding torches, hammers clanged against steel, and workers shouted instructions through the dust. It was another long day for the crew building a new office tower on the edge of the city. Among them was Mark, a young electrician in his mid-20s. He was hardworking, eager to prove himself, and proud that his hands were helping to create something that would stand tall for decades. That morning, the supervisor called him over. "Mark, the lighting on the third floor isn't working. Go check the panel." Mark grabbed his toolbox, wiped sweat from his forehead, and nodded. He had done this task many times before. But what he didn't know was that this time, the conditions were far more dangerous. The electrical panel had been reported faulty earlier in the week. Normally, the entire system would be shut down before anyone touched it. But today, the project was behind schedule. The supervisors wanted the job finished quickly, no matter what. "It's just a small problem," one of them said. "Fix it fast, we don't have time to shut everything down." Mark carried his tools up the temporary wooden stairs, the floor creaking beneath his boots. On the third floor, he found the panel. Its metal door hung slightly open, wires sticking out like tangled vines. Some were taped, others were bare, shining with a faint metallic gleam. He paused, uneasy. Something about it looked wrong. He should have stopped. He should have insisted on shutting down the power. But the voices in his head were louder. "Don't look weak. Don't slow the job. Just get it done." So he set down his toolbox and pulled on his gloves. Nearby, two of his coworkers were moving ladders and carrying pipes. They barely noticed Mark kneel by the panel. He grabbed his screwdriver and leaned closer, carefully pushing aside a loose wire. At first, nothing happened. He exhaled slowly, focusing on the task. But in the very next moment, his hand brushed against a live wire. A blinding flash lit the room. Sparks burst out like fireworks, filling the air with the sharp smell of burning metal. Mark let out a strangled cry as thousands of volts surged through his body. The coworkers spun around in shock. "Mark," one of them shouted, dropping the pipe with a loud clang. They saw him trembling violently, his body rigid, his hand locked onto the wire as if glued to it. The current held him prisoner, refusing to let go. His eyes widened in terror, and his scream turned into silence as smoke curled from the gloves meant to protect him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the circuit tripped, and the power cut out. Mark collapsed onto the dusty floor, his body twitching slightly, his chest struggling for breath. The workers rushed to his side. One shouted for the foreman, another grabbed his phone to call an ambulance. "Stay with us, Mark," his friend pleaded, shaking his shoulder gently. Mark's face was pale, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. But no words came, only shallow gasps. The site fell into chaos. The foreman arrived, shouting orders, his face tight with fear. Why wasn't the panel shut down? Who told him to work it live? Nobody answered. Everyone knew the truth. The rush, the shortcuts, the endless pressure to finish faster. Minutes later, the paramedics arrived, carrying a stretcher and equipment. They checked Mark's pulse, applied oxygen, and worked quickly to stabilize him. His coworkers stood back, silent, ashamed, and terrified. By the time the ambulance sped away, the entire site had fallen into a heavy silence. The men looked at each other, realizing how close they had all been to witnessing a death. Some whispered prayers, others cursed under their breath. All of them knew this wasn't just an accident, it was a failure to respect the power of electricity. The safety officer arrived later that afternoon. He walked through the site, shaking his head as he inspected the exposed wires, the lack of warning signs, the missing lockout systems. "This should never have happened," he said firmly. "Electricity is silent, invisible, and deadly. One mistake, one rushed job, and it's over." The workers listened quietly, each one thinking about how easily it could have been them. Mark was young, careful, and skilled, yet still he had been seconds away from losing his life. If not for the circuit breaker, he would not have survived at all. That night, as the sun set behind the half-built tower, the crew went home with heavy hearts. They replayed the moment in their minds, the flash, the scream, the way Mark fell. It was a picture none of them would ever forget. For Mark, recovery would take months. His hands were burned, his body weak, his mind shaken by the trauma. But he was alive, and that was a miracle. He later admitted to his family, "I knew I should have shut it down. I knew the risk, but I didn't want to say no." And that was the real lesson. In every workplace, no matter how busy, no matter how loud the pressure from above, safety has to come first. Electricity doesn't forgive mistakes. You can't see it, you can't smell it, but it waits quietly, ready to strike the moment you let your guard down. The incident became a warning story told to every new worker who joined that site: never work on live wires. Never let the rush of the job cost you your life. Because in the end, no deadline is worth dying for. The wind blew hard across the tall building as the sun rose, casting long shadows on the half-finished structure. From the ground below, the workers looked like tiny figures moving carefully along steel beams and scaffolding that reached high into the sky. It was the kind of job that demanded courage. Every day, men climbed ladders, balanced on narrow planks, and worked dozens of stories above the ground. One small mistake could change everything. Among the crew was James, a roofer in his 40s. He had worked construction for more than 20 years. People respected him for his experience and steady hands. He often joked with the younger workers, saying, "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. Don't worry, I know how to keep my balance." That morning, the foreman handed out assignments. "We need the roofing panels fixed on the south side. The rain's coming tomorrow, and we can't leave it open." James nodded and climbed the scaffold, carrying his tool belt and a coil of rope. His partner for the day was Luis, a younger worker still learning the trade. As they reached the rooftop, the view stretched wide across the city. Cars looked like toys far below, and the sound of horns floated faintly upward. The air smelled of fresh tar and steel. James set down his tools and inspected the area. There were safety harnesses available, but only a few anchor points. Some workers skipped using them because it slowed things down. James glanced at the rope and thought, "It's just a quick job. I'll be careful." Luis clipped his harness to a metal ring, but James left his lying coiled near his tools. "I've done this 1,000 times, he said with a grin. "Just watch your step and follow my lead." At first, everything went smoothly. The two men laid out panels, hammered them in place, and tightened bolts. But as the sun climbed higher, the wind picked up, rattling the scaffolding and making loose tarps flap loudly. Luis bent down, gripping the roof nervously. "It's getting windy," he said. James waved him off. "It's fine, just keep working, we'll be done soon." Then it happened. As James stepped backward to grab another panel, his boot landed on a patch of dust and loose gravel. His foot slipped, and in an instant, his body lurched toward the edge. He threw his arms out, trying to catch something, but there was nothing within reach. Luis screamed, "James!" He lunged forward, but he was too far away. James slid across the rooftop, his hands clawing at the surface, and then, with a horrifying silence, he went over the edge. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. The workers below looked up, hearing the shout, and saw a figure falling through the air. Tools flew from James's belt, glinting in the sunlight as they tumbled after him. His helmet slipped off, spinning downward. The fall lasted only seconds, but for everyone watching, it felt like forever. Then came the impact, a sickening thud that echoed through the construction site. The workers froze in shock, their faces pale. Someone dropped their hammer. Someone else whispered, "No." Luis stood on the roof, shaking violently, staring at the empty space where James had been only moments before. His stomach twisted as the reality hit him. If James had clipped his harness, if he had taken one small precaution, he would still be alive. The foreman ran to the scene, shouting for everyone to stop working. "Get down from there," he yelled, his voice breaking. Several men rushed to the ground where James lay motionless. But there was nothing anyone could do. The silence that followed was heavier than the wind. Some workers cried openly, others turned away, unable to look. Luis sat down on the rooftop, holding his helmet in his hands, tears rolling down his cheeks. He couldn't stop thinking, it should have been different. He knew better. Why didn't he use the harness? Later, the safety inspectors arrived. They measured the rooftop, checked the anchor points, and interviewed the crew. Their conclusion was clear: this death could have been prevented. The harness was available, the rules were written, but one moment of overconfidence, one decision to skip protection, had cost a man his life. At the memorial service, James's family sat in the front row, his wife holding their children close. His co-workers stood quietly at the back, their faces filled with guilt and sorrow. The priest spoke of his hard work, his years of dedication, and the tragic reminder that life can change in a heartbeat. For weeks afterward, the crew could not shake the memory. Some dreamed of the fall, waking up in the night in a cold sweat. Others refused to step onto rooftops until stricter safety measures were enforced. The company installed more anchor points, demanded harness use at all times, and held new training sessions. But for James, it was too late. His story became a lesson told to every new worker. Never ignore safety, never think you're too experienced to fall. Gravity doesn't care how many years you've worked. In the end, the lesson was simple but powerful. Every time you work at height, clip the harness, secure the ladder, and respect the danger. Because falling takes only a second, but the cost lasts forever.